Assalamu alaikum. There is a very wide variety of laryngeal patterns or mechanisms a human larynx can use to produce a very wide range of fundamental frequencies for certain periods of time. In reality, a certain individual would only choose to use or employ few patterns or styles or mechanisms for laryngeal adjustments by distribution of the tension and the geometry of the larynx. These are called the vocal registers, laryngeal vibratory mechanisms. So here are common examples of different ways a larynx can adopt to produce a certain required frequency. And the same larynx can choose to have this mechanism, the M1 mechanism, to produce lower frequency, or shift to another mechanism to produce higher frequencies. In the first mechanism, you can see that the vocal folds have a full body vibration. The lower lips of the medial ends meet first in the midline, followed by the upper ends, and they remain closed in the midline for a certain amount of period. The closed phase of the cycle is much longer than the closed phase of the cycle for the other mechanism, in which the vocal folds are stretched in the anteroposterior direction. They have a very short closed phase. Only the edges of the vocal fold can meet in the midline and vibrate, and they produce a higher frequency compared to the first mechanism. So a certain way a larynx can choose to produce a certain frequency is called a register or a laryngeal vibratory mechanism. These registers or laryngeal vibratory mechanisms have three characteristics. They have a certain vibratory pattern, a certain pattern of the vocal folds that is different from other registers. They also cover a certain range of fundamental frequencies and produce a certain type of sound. These are the ways you can differentiate between a certain register or a certain laryngeal vibratory mechanism from the other. The way the vocal registers or the laryngeal vibratory mechanisms are classified is rather confusing because there is no much general agreement about how many registers are there and the exact description of each of them. This is a common way of classifying the vocal registers, starting with the register at the lower end of the fundamental frequencies, the pulse register. This register, this configuration of the larynx produces the lowest range of vocal frequencies. It has other names like a vocal fry or a glottal fry or a creaky voice. The vibratory pattern of the vocal folds here produces a rather long closed phase of vibration, and the fundamental frequency produced would be less than 70 hertz and this is 20 to 60 hertz. This is followed higher up the scale by the modal register, the one that we most commonly use during speaking or even singing. It's characterized by complete adduction during vibration and produces frequencies between 100 and 300 Hz. It has other names like chest or head, middle or heavy voice. The top of the range is the loft register. It has other names like falsetto. It's the highest vocal frequencies range produced by the larynx and is characterized by vibration of thin and tense vocal folds that are stretched in the anteroposterior direction and have only minimal vibration. They can produce fundamental frequencies in the range of 275 up to 1100 Hz per second. But beside this traditional way of classifying registers into three registers, the pulse, the modal, and the loft register, there are other ways of classifying the laryngeal vibratory mechanisms or vocal registers, including the classification of laryngeal vibratory mechanism into four types from M0 to M3. Whether there are 3, 4, or 5 vocal registers depend on whether you include the lower register, the vocal fry, in the pulse register, or M0 here, or whether you have it separately. And the same applies to the higher end of the scale, whether you include the whistle register, the higher voiced females, in the loft register, or have it as M3 in the other classification. So that's the basis for the confusion between the number of vocal registers. We would notice here a change in three things: a change in the frequency, the configuration of the vocal fold, and the voice. You see how the frequency here has exceeded 200 something, with a stretching of the anteroposterior direction of the vocal fold, and then it vibrates at a lower frequency, much lower frequency, with full vibration of the body of the vocal fold. The lower ends of the medial part of the vocal folds meet first, followed by the upper ends. And that's the idea about classifying a certain mechanism or configuration into a register, a certain voice, a certain frequency range, and a certain configuration of the larynx. That was the pulse register, the lowest frequency range a laryngeal vibratory mechanism can produce. It has other names like a vocal fry or mechanism 0, the M0. The voice produced has very low fundamental frequencies, less than 70 Hz, and it's quite deep and thick. It sounds like, "Yes, it's Friday." The larynx can produce this register by lowering the level of activation of the laryngeal muscles to minimize any tension in the vocal folds and avoid any stretching of the vocal folds in the anteroposterior direction. This would leave the bulky vocal folds in opposition, in contact, during the closed phase of each vibratory cycle. So you have longer closed phase and you have fewer vibratory cycle producing the low frequency. The closed larynx permits only bubbles of air to pass through the thickened vocal folds with a larger depth than usual, and this will produce the popping or very low frequency sound characteristic of this register. The sound produced can also be aharmonic or have some periods of doubling or irregularities. The way the characteristic voice in the pulse register of the vocal fry is produced is through a loose glottal closure. A loose glottal closure that is brought about by approximation of the arytenoid cartilage, but leaving little tension in the vocal folds itself. The vocal folds itself would be compact, slack, floppy, with a deep depth, and the medial ends would be in contact but with no much tension, and this would allow the air to escape through it at a lower frequency, just like bubbles of air would come out of these thickened and deep medial ends of the vocal folds. There will be some irregularities because successive vibrations would differ in their duration and size in the amplitude as well, and that will produce the characteristic low frequency, popping or rattling sound in the pulse register. This is the modal register, the mechanism number 1 in laryngeal vibratory mechanisms, sometimes called the chest register as well. You can see that it covers the range of frequencies that we usually use in conversation, speech, and also in singing, anything between 100 and 300 hertz. The vocal folds meet in the midline and remain closed completely during the closing phase of the vibratory cycle. The lower lips of the medial ends meet first, followed by the upper lips. The cross-section of the vocal folds is like a triangle, and in the pulse register it's more of a square, and the approximation of the vocal fold is complete during the adductory cycle. And during the lower tones, the larynx is brought inferiorly by the influence of the infrahyoid muscles. The voice produced by the modal register would be rich in harmonics and would be perceived as a continuous sound rather than like in the pulse register, in which the voice would be perceived as discrete pulses or bursts of energy. This is brought about by the rapid closure of the vocal cords during the closing phase compared to the opening phase of the folds, which is much more gradual. The vibrations would be regular with a frequency between 100 and 300 hertz. The medial ends of the vocal folds would have the appropriate depth, and the lower lips would close before the upper lips, giving a vertical phase difference between the vocal folds. Now the loft register, sometimes called falsetto, or mechanism number 2 in the laryngeal vibratory mechanisms. It covers the higher range of frequencies. It's brought about by the activation of the cricothyroid muscle that would tense the vocal folds in the anteroposterior direction and also stretches in the anteroposterior direction in length. The vocal folds would be lengthened, tensed, with very thin edges that would barely touch in the midline during adduction, giving incomplete adduction, and the subglottic pressure would be increased, and the frequency would also be significantly increased. To bring about the highest notes, the larynx would be pulled upwards with the influence of the suprahyoid muscles. With the significant activation of the cricothyroides muscle in the loft register, the vocal fold anteroposterior length would be increased. The vocal fold stiffness and tension would also increase. The medial ends of the vocal folds would be much thinned. There wouldn't be much of a vertical thickness of the medial ends of the vocal fold. The open phase of the vibratory cycle would be increased. The waves produced would have a much higher vibratory cycle, so the FO would increase significantly, but there would be only a limited number of harmonics. There would be a considerable overlap between the voice range of the modal register or the loft register, mechanism number 1 or mechanism number 2, in females and in males, as much as 1 octave overlap between the two mechanisms or the two registers. The characteristic thing about the loft register voice It's flute-like with few harmonics or overtones. The main body of the vocal folds, the core, is relaxed, but the cover, the edges of the vocal fold are stretched and thinned, and it's the edges that actually vibrates during the phonatory cycle. The voice produced by the loft register is more limited in dynamic variation and tone quality compared to the modal voice. During speech, we keep changing between different registers. Some people use the M0 mechanism in speech at the end of the sentence. This is an example about the transition between modal and pulse register when someone is saying, idea is that. You could see the vibratory pattern using the modal register with an M here as sort of a very regular vibrations compared to the creaky voice in here and in there. While saying idea, at the end of the idea, you could see the creaky pulse here. You could see the separate bursts of energy and the irregular in the frequency at a much lower rate compared to the modal register. Similarly, transition between different vocal registers can happen between the modal and the loft register, the so-called falsetto register. If this transition is very abrupt with very rapid changes, it can cause a voice break. The explanation for the transition between registers, how this happens, can be either due to the change in the acoustic resonance of the subglottal system, or alternatively it can happen due to a decrease in the activation of the thyroarytenoides muscle, which is very active during the modal register voice production and less active during the loft register activation. The voice transition into a different register during singing is called passaggio, the Italian word for passage. It refers to a voice shift or transition in a different register during singing. The passaggio marks the end or the boundary of one register and the beginning of the next. A trained singer would not allow the larynx to suddenly make changes between registers. They would gradually change the vibratory pattern while ascending or descending in pitch, because a sudden or abrupt change in the transition between different registers would give a break of the voice. This would happen commonly among untrained singers. The tone may abruptly change and become thin or weak, or the voice may crack or even is cut out completely. The whistle register, or the flageolet, or mechanism 3, is considered by some as a separate register or a separate laryngeal vibratory mechanism, while others would consider this as just an extension of the loft register. It's the highest possible register, the highest possible frequency range produced by the human larynx. It produces a sound that have a narrow and piercing quality, much like a whistle or the upper notes of a flute. There is no clear passaggio between it and the loft register. That's why some would consider it as just an extension of the loft register. You could see the very high frequency during the production of this register. So to sum up, There are few laryngeal vibratory mechanisms that can explain the way we use our larynxes during speech and during singing. These few laryngeal vibratory mechanisms or registers are given different names by different people, but they can be classified as M0, which represents the pulse register or the vocal fry, in which the vocal folds core and cover are both loose with little tension. In mechanism number 1, which corresponds to the modal register, the vocal fold body and cover both has certain amount of tension, and they both contribute to the vibration. In mechanism number 2, which corresponds to the loft register, the vocal fold body does not vibrate, but the vocal fold cover is very tensed and would do most of the vibration. The fourth mechanism, the M3, has the whistle, the register, has the vocal folds edges very thin and very tightly stretched, and only the cover of the vocal fold would vibrate and would give almost always incomplete vocal fold closure. By this, we come to the end on this presentation on the vocal registers, the laryngeal vibratory mechanisms. Assalamu alaikum.